talking about the fighting for monetary policy that has now taken place within the Federal Reserve and the FOMC. This is the Federal Open Market Committee and the people who vote on monetary policy. Major dissent that has taken place right now within the Fed. The vote has just come out. They are planning on lowering interest rates another quarter point on the Fed funds in the target range. However, major dissent taken place within these Fed officials. Voting for monetary policy action was Jerome Powell, John C. Williams, Vice President Chair, or that was Michael Barr, Michelle Bowman, Susan Collins, Lisa Cook. Those were the ones who voted for monetary policy to be lowered by a quarter point. And then we had Philip Jefferson, Mausoleum, I cannot say his right name right. Christopher Waller, they voted against this action, and with Stephen Myron, who had preferred to lower the target range by a half a percentage point. That is incredible to think, right? They wanted it a whole 50 basis points. And then also Austin Goolsbee and Jerry Schmid, who preferred to leave no change to the target. Now, that's something interesting to think about. So here you had two Fed officials saying that, no, we don't want it to change at all. We want it to stay right where it's at. Then you had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, five of them say that they wanted to lower, and the rest of them said that they wanted a quarter point, and the other one said that they want a half a point. Three different opinions on where the Fed funds rate should be, coming from the FOMC. These are the people who vote on monetary policy. Something that I find very interesting is that these 12 people who are very lost in the idea of public attention, right? Like, nobody knows who these people are. Lisa Cook got some attention just recently because she was Trump wanted to fire her, but obviously that didn't take place. She's still voting on monetary policy. And maybe John Williams being the New York Fed president, but outside of that, Jerome Powell is by far the only person that anybody really ever thinks about at the FOMC voting on monetary policy. In fact, a lot of people think that it's Jerome Powell who is conducting monetary policy. If you look here, you can see that there is many votes that take place in order to create the monetary policy that we now experience within the financial systems. And now understanding that there is a definite plan that has taken place within this strategy, how it is that they achieve that plan is the different strategies that these are now voting on. That's why there is so much difference in it. They look at it and say, yes, we are all in a common idea on where we want to be, but they have different opinions on how to get there. Now, when we go and read through the statement, this is what it says. Available indicators suggest that the economic activity has been expanding at a moderate pace. Job gains have slowed this year, and unemployment rate has edged up. Now, they had removed the words, but remained low through August. So now they removed that wordage, right? The remained low. But they are essentially saying that unemployment rate has edged up, but it's not of concern yet, right? This is no longer low. It's now in a position in which that I guess would be like normal. I don't know if there's a normal anyway. But they're not calling it high. They're just saying that it's not low. Right? It goes on to say September, more recent indicators are consistent with these developments. Inflation has moved up since early in the year and remains somewhat elevated. Now that right there is the reason why some of these Fed officials are not wanting to lower interest rates. They are saying that the inflation has edged up, and because of that edging up of inflation, they don't want to lower in interest rates and become accommodating to the economy. They want to make sure that they stay somewhat restrictive. Right? And this is one of the reasons, because they're seeing that inflation moving up. Going on. The committee seeks to achieve maximum employment and inflation at the rate of 2% over the long run. And that's always very misleading for a lot of people. They hear the 2% target, but then miss out on the long run actual strategy, which means that they may let inflation run above the 2% target to make up from past deviations from it. That is never included in the statement, but when you listen to the Federal Reserve and their speeches and everything they've talked about, they have mentioned that many times. Uncertainty, I love this word, uncertainty about the economic outlook remains elevated. Now, that in itself is a reason that is concern for the people out there to then look at the Federal Reserve and say, hey, you need to keep those interest rates elevated in order to fight off inflation. But at the same time, you're trying to deal with an unemployment rising issue. And this is where the deviation in opinions began to take place, right? The committee is attentive to the risk to both sides of its dual mandate and judges that downside risk to employment rose in recent months. In support of its goals, in light of the shift in the balance of risk, the committee decided to lower the target range of the Fed funds rate by a quarter percentage point to 3.5 to 3.75, right? Gone down from the 4%. In considering, and they've added this word, right? These words, in considering the next extent in time, good Lord, in considering the extent and timing of, right? This is added, the extent and timing of additional adjustments to the target range for the Fed funds rate. The committee will carefully assess incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risk. So let me read that again. And considering the extent and timing of the additional adjustments to the target range for the Fed funds rate, the committee will carefully assess incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risk. So ultimately, they're leaving it open-ended, right? And that's what they're saying. They have no commitment to the future path. They are going to talk about the extent and timing as additional information comes in. So they are basically saying, hey, over the course of between now and the next meeting, we are going to deploy words. That's essentially what they're saying, right? In considering the extent and timing of additional adjustments to the range of the Fed funds rate, the committee will carefully assess incoming data and evolve in the evolving outlook and the balance of risk. They will be talking about that as it goes forward. They removed these words. The committee decided to conclude the reduction of the aggregate securities holdings on December 1st. So this was the ending of the quantitative tightening. Now, something very concerning is people heard ending of quantitative tightening and immediately assumed quantitative easing. That is not the case. It is so important to understand. Large-scale asset purchases is quantitative easing. That is not taking place because the quantitative tightening has come to an end. I mean, large-scale asset purchases is quantitative easing, not just buying of securities, large-scale purchases, right? Generally, that happens at the lower bound. In fact, it always happens at the lower bound of zero because it is a tool to deal with the lower bound of zero when interest rate adjustments is no longer effective. That's when quantitative easing is used. That's very important to understand. Most people are missing that when they say that they're about ready to fire up quantitative easing again. Not with elevated interest rates. That is not why they use quantitative easing. They use quantitative easing at the lower bound of zero because interest rate adjustments is no longer an effective tool. This is something that Ben Bernanke brought up back in 2002 in his speech, Deflation and How to Prevent It from Ever Occurring Here, was large-scale asset purchases can be used at the lower bound. Right? So that, again, like all those people out there who are screaming quantitative easing and stuff like that, they are really missing out on what it is that's happening with monetary policy. That is a complete assumption. Okay, and I'll explain why that's an assumption that has actually been stated within the statement here. Okay, I gotta slow down. I'm talking too fast. I had a lot of coffee. You guys know I drink way too much coffee. So they removed the words, the committee decided to conclude the reduction of the aggregate securities on December 1st. The committee is strongly committed to supporting maximum employment and returning inflation to the 2% objective. Again, objective, right? I love how these statements never really use target, right? They say let's see, what did they say? The 2% over the long run, the 2% objective, right? And then people assume that's a 2% target, but very rarely will you ever see a Fed official actually say 2% target. Usually it's 2% goal or something of that nature. Okay, in assessing the appropriate stance in monetary policy, the committee will continue to monitor the implications of incoming information for economic outlook. Again, data dependent, right? Data dependent, gotta say, we don't know what we're doing, we gotta get the data in, leaving it open-ended. This is part of their ploy. The committee would be prepared to adjust the stance of monetary policy as appropriate if the risks emerge that could impede the attainment of the committee's goals. The committee assessments will take into account the wide range of information, including readings on labor market conditions, inflation pressures, and inflation expectations, and inflation in financial and international developments. But I think that's important to also recognize that they mark that differently, right? Between inflation pressures and inflation expectations, two different things. Very important. A lot of times people don't look at it as two different things. It is. It's two different things. Inflation expectations is definitely different from inflation and how it is that they guide inflation expectations. The committee judges that the reserve balance have declined to ample levels and will initiate purchases of short-term treasury securities as needed to maintain ample supply of reserves on an ongoing basis. That statement, people are misunderstanding that as quantitative easing. That is not quantitative easing. All right, it is not quantitative easing. Large-scale asset purchases of a particular amount, $50 billion a month for the next 6 months or for on an ongoing basis. That's large-scale asset purchases. This is now basically maintaining a position, right? In fact, I think doesn't it even say that? To maintain ample supply of reserves on an ongoing basis. So if you confuse that from quantitative easing, you're really going to misunderstand what it is that the Federal Reserve is doing with that. People will then just immediately assume that it's money printer go burr and balance sheet expansion and all this stuff that's going to be happening within the economy, but that's not really what's happening. See, balance sheet expansion is a monetary policy tool when the Federal Reserve no longer has the ability to adjust interest rates because of the proximity of the lower bound to zero. So when the Fed funds rate is dropping because of a deflationary scenario, and that Fed funds rate comes down and passes R star, which is essentially the neutral interest rate when an economy is prevailing at potential with low and stable inflation, low inflation with stable prices and full employment. That's R star, but unfortunately, because R star is so low and so close to the lower bound to zero, that if you come into a position in the economy in which that a deflationary scenario is taken hold and the inflation is removed from the data points, right, from all the information that we are getting as far as where they are getting their information from, because I know a lot of people just want to say that the inflation is totally fake. We have to understand it from their point of view, that they are looking at an inflationary scenario on top of where it is that the neutral interest rate would be prior to that inflationary scenario and trying to position the Fed funds rate above that. Now, very difficult for a lot of people to put their heads around that, but this is what the Federal Reserve is attempting to do. All right? This is how they are keeping the economy restricted, is by maintaining a Fed funds rate that is slightly above the inflationary scenario that has taken place in order to bring that inflation down. But that's not really what the case is, right? The inflation is where they want it to be. And that, I know, is not what you're hearing here, but that is what they want. They want a persistently high inflation, because they get to be able to talk about those interest rate adjustments as the main policy tool. You can see how much impact that has on the people. They hang on every single word that the Federal Reserve says. Now, if there was a case in which that the inflation was removed, right, all of a sudden it's just gone, or for whatever reason, hypothetically speaking, then the Federal Reserve would have to be somewhere around 5%, or I'm not sorry, 0.5% in order to be neutral. This is important. They would have to be about 0.5% in order to be neutral if you removed all the inflationary scenario. Now, that proximity to the lower bound, that 0.5%, does not give them any room to lower interest rates to actually stimulate the economy in a deflationary or lack of inflationary position within the economy. That's where they'll fire up quantitative easing. Not here, where you have elevated interest rates, you have elevated inflation, you have elevated inflation expectations, you have low unemployment. You know, it's not low, right? Not anymore, not according to their statement, but essentially look at a chart of unemployment, it's fairly low. This is not a position in which that the Federal Reserve would be firing up quantitative easing. Again, that happens at the lower bound of zero. Okay. Did I just confuse the hell out of everybody with that one? See, like this is what you get when you get raw, uncut, unedited, and no real notes other than the statement itself. That's the only thing I brought out here. And so, as everybody else tries to perfect their sentences and edit so that you don't have any mistakes, you get the raw, uncut version of the uneducated economist here. All right. Let me see here. Brody, we got Simon. I'm fairly sure that's intentional because I've seen firsthand that ignorant analysis will take positions purely on the basis that they think the Fed printing due to their lack of clarity. Yeah, I mean, well, I've seen it many times too. And that a lot of times you will find that just because it's the Federal Reserve, they are just in, like, even during quantitative tightening, people were still thinking they were printing money during that time. Like, I mean, completely opposite. Like literally, like the money supply was shrinking, and then people were out there screaming, "Money printer, go burr!" And I'm like, holy moly, man! People really are lost on what has taken place. Quantitative easing and quantitative tightening are definitely two different things. Large-scale asset purchases and essentially large-scale asset depletion. Right, but it never really comes off that much off the balance sheet. It only depleted just a little bit, normalizing, but it never gets to normal. I mean, I don't know why they call it normalizing, because it's never like normal again. It just becomes essentially a new normal. So like that's what they should really be calling it, new normalization. Not normalizing to what you would have expected. Normalizing mean now you feel it's normal, not like it was. Now it is. All right, all night or bank reserves, supposed to be the base of which lending is created, is really just a way to make the people feel secure in a slippery currency. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I have no clue what the hell you're saying, but I do know you got lumber dead nuts right. Well, thank you, what is that? Tattoos and water? Tattoos and water? Interesting handle. Thank you very much. Yeah, and I appreciate it because, yeah, I really do feel like when it came to the lumber industry and calling out the lumber market, really nobody else had it as accurate as I did. Many times I found people out there talking about lumber industry with 1 million views on their channel, 1 million views on their video, talking about how it was that the money printer is causing lumber prices to go up off the charts. And I realized something, that it's not the truth that people want, it's the best story that they want. And that's one of the reasons why I feel like my channel is really not as popular as it once was, is because the story that I'm telling is not a popular one. It's not the one that people want to hear. People want to hear the one of what it's their fault, they're going to be dying, they're going to be suffering the consequences at any moment because it makes them feel good about having failed in the position in which that they are now sucking in life. And when I tell people, man, you have to take consideration for yourself of what it is that this economy is and own the economy. Because if you blame it on somebody else, you're going to suffer the consequences from that. There's really no saving this at any given moment. Like, there's no way. If like, this is what people are hoping for, like at any moment here it's going to switch and all of a sudden we're going to have like this awesome experience here within this world or something. And I think to myself, man, how is it that we grew up with this belief system? Like the movies, the music, the TV shows, the schools, our parents, all taught us in such a way that we actually are hopeful and wishful of the future, not realizing, man, this is not something that you should be wishful and hopeful for, but something that you need to take control of 100%. Thinking that it's, oh man, we all need to be fair and we need to act like it's fair and that there's going to be like this fair outcome for everybody to, be all awesome and being like, in a fair existence. I don't know how to put it, but it's not fair. It's just like, it's not a fair system and it's not going to be fair, and there's nothing you can do to make it fair because there's people out there who recognized how to position themselves in such a way that they were going to acquire more. When they acquire more, it separates the rich from the poor. There is no stopping that. There is so much evidence of Cantillon effect taking place throughout history that, to deny it is really like, I don't know, like, to deny the Cantillon effect is taking place is, I don't even know, like, I don't want to basically to say it's like stupid or delusional or something of that nature, but it's really I think it's a misinterpretation of what it is that's happening out here if you do not include the Cantillon effect. Okay. All right. The Jesus, the bread of life, containing pot and shroomies, went to smoke hash with Simon and talk monetary policy. Ha ha ha. Also, hello, all-nighter hider and all. Let's see here. What we got here? All-nighter. Fiscal spending will run out by 2027. Monetary spending needs to start up. Monetary spending needs to start up. Yeah, I don't know. Like, a lot of times I think people are going to look out there and think about the Federal Reserve and the government somehow trying to create an environment that the average everyday person is going to have like a decent way. And that's unfortunate, because that's essentially what they are promising. Like, all the politicians and everybody out there are saying that's what they're doing. But ultimately, you think like anybody is going to be self-preserving first, right? Like, you are going to make sure that you are taken care of first, and then if you can take care of number one, then you will look out there to take care of, like, other people that may be, close to you or whatever. That human instinct, that human behavior within it will then deny the politicians of doing the right thing. And because the right thing, whatever that is, because I don't know what the right thing is anymore, because I just come to the understanding that there's no way that there is going to be a right thing. But to understand that a politician would have to literally decide that him and his buddy, or her, them and their buddies, all their friends, all the rich elitists out there would have to lower their standard of living to then give the environment, the economy, the ability for that working class individual to have a shot at being able to acquire the things in their life. If they all simultaneously do not lower their standard of living on purpose with their own decision-making process, then it just will not happen. I know nobody is going to do that. Well, maybe a couple of people, but no, like, the entire elitist class is not going to do that together, right? That is not something that is going to happen. And there's no way you can force that outcome either. I don't care who you vote for, because there's never been evidence of that taking place. Now, there are people they will punish if you vote for the right ones. Those, like, you vote for the right people, they will punish a certain group, but I guarantee you it will not result in the outcome that you're looking for. You will be punished as a result of it as well. Just look at any communistic country out there. They all essentially came down from the same thing. Hey, we're going to make sure that you all keep your working class jobs, and then a boot on the face of humanity starts to take place, as nobody can really succeed or become anywhere like extremely wealthy, by anybody's standards by it anyhow. All right, what else we got? We all have 24 hours. Question, are we neutral, restricted, accommodating? Well, and I think that's probably why you had 3 dissenting votes, right? A couple of them think that we are still far above neutral, still restricted. There's a couple of them that must think that we're very close to neutral, saying that we don't need to cut rates. Now, understanding it, where do you think, here, how about this? If you really want to know the question for yourself, what do you really believe? Do you believe in the inflationary scenario that has taken place? Do you believe it's at 2.2, 2.5, 2.8, 3.2, wherever that is? Like, I mean, the official numbers don't mean anything to me anymore. What do they mean to you? What does the inflation mean to you, and where do you think that's at in relation to what it is that the Federal Reserve is looking at? Because if you really want to know if it's neutral, or if the monetary policy is neutral, according to the Federal Reserve's monetary policy stance, you have to think, what is it the Federal Reserve is looking at as far as an inflationary scenario, right? If they are seeing it at 2.5, 2.8, and you have a R star of a half a point, then most likely Fed funds rate would be somewhere right around 3 to 3.5% in order to maintain neutral. What are they at? 3.5 to 3 3/4. Wow, slightly above neutral. Now, if the inflationary scenario falls, then that Fed funds rate is going to have to fall in order to maintain the neutral position. If the inflation falls and the Fed funds rate stays still, then they will be accommodating. If for whatever reason the credible threat of tariffs convinces the people that there's going to be more inflation, or for whatever supply chain breakdowns or whatever comes next, and we have an inflation that rises and the Fed stands still, that inflationary scenario could move the neutral interest rate up above the Fed funds rate and cause the economy to be accommodating. So really it comes down to the inflation and the inflation expectation that is going to be coming into the future. That is really where you should be looking as far as where the Fed funds rate is going to be neutral or not. Again, I have explained this so many times, and I understand that R-star is probably one of the most hardest things to wrap your head around. Okay? But the more you start to study it, the more you recognize what it is that the Federal Reserve was facing for a problem back in 2018. All the R-star and neutral interest rate kind of jargon and stuff really starts to line up and make a lot more sense. But you have to understand what the problem was back prior to COVID, because COVID solved the problem. And most people don't know that. They don't see it that way. They don't realize that there was an opportunistic reflation that took place during COVID. And since most people don't understand what an opportunistic reflation would be, really we here on the Uneducated Economist got that statement, opportunistic reflations, directly from Lael Brainerd back in 2019 from a speech that she gave talking about the monetary policy and communications about it. This is the reason why I'm so adamant about describing it in the way that I am, not because I imagine this scenario and want to stick with it. It's because this is how the Federal Reserve has described their monetary policy. This is what they are doing. They are trying to deal with the proximity of the lower bound of zero with a neutral interest rate right next to it. That's the problem that they found. If they have elevated inflation or a persistently high inflation, then they can get the Fed funds rate far above that neutral in order to deal with the fact that they have elevated inflation, which is a persistently high inflationary scenario that gives them the ability to then talk about the adjustment of the Fed funds rate. Talking about the Fed funds rate is far more important than trying to do quantitative easing. It's far more important to monetary policy than trying to do quantitative easing at the lower bound of zero. I've gone over this stuff so many times. I can break it down in a million different directions. It will not change. It will always be the same thing that I am going to tell you. The fact that the Fed had run out of monetary policy during the great financial crisis, and that R-star, the neutral interest rate, being very close to zero, meant that they had no more room to adjust the interest rates in order to stimulate the economy. There was nothing left there. They came up with large-scale asset purchases and forward guidance. The promise to keep interest rates at the lower bound for a significant amount of time, zero interest rate policy, and with that belief, the investors then had chosen to take less of a premium on their long-term secured assets, basically the treasuries, which lowered the long-term interest rates. This is how the Federal Reserve was able to adjust interest rates within the economy without actually having to move the Fed funds rate around. Quantitative easing and that forward guidance. Now, with the elevated inflation, elevated Fed funds rate, they have an ability to communicate about the adjustment of the Fed funds rate, which has a profound impact on the economy, and you can see that taking place today. All right, did I forget to turn the Wi-Fi off? I probably did. How was the audio? The audio is probably terrible, huh? Sorry, guys. I only see, 76 people watching right now. Oh, let's see here. What time is it? What time is it? It is 12:03. All right, I got a few more minutes left here. Anyway, I don't know. You guys got any questions, statements you guys want to talk about? Want me to break anything down for you? I mean, the more I look at this information, the more I break down monetary policy, and the more I look at what it is that the Federal Reserve was needing for their monetary policy with inflation expectations being elevated so they can get that neutral interest rate elevated, all this stuff makes a whole lot more sense. When I listen to a lot of the politicians out there talk about how it is that the Federal Reserve is being forced to listen to the administration or being forced into particular directions because of, I don't know, one one economic indicator or another. And I think about it and I'm like, okay, well, I will absorb that information. Like I will listen to it if you can include some of the things when it talks about like the neutral interest rate and the position around that. How inflation and the R star are now combined together to put the Federal Reserve in a particular position. If that isn't included in the discussion, then it's going to be very difficult for me to understand how it is that they are seeing the reactionary functions of the Federal Reserve based on their indicator. And that's where I think the whole thing begins to break down. Is because essentially when I hear somebody say something like, oh, well, look at the 10-year, and once the 10-year moves this way, the Federal Reserve is going to be forced to do this. And I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I've never seen anything within the Fed's statements, within their speeches, with anything of their communications that said anything about the 10-year like that. Now, I'm not trying to say these people are wrong with their indicator. I'm just saying that nowhere in the Federal Reserve statements or anything that I have ever read when it comes to their strategy have they said that. Never once have I seen it. Never once have I seen where they will bow down to the administration or even included the administration within their speech. Like, very rarely do they talk about it. They talk about the tariffs and how that might create an inflationary expectation going into the future, and they'd like to see what that means. And I know they would like to see what that means for any kind of distance of time in order for them to position the Fed funds rate to be neutral. If you remove the tariff and expectations, then you would probably have the Fed funds rate dropping quite dramatically. If the Supreme Court comes out and votes these things illegal, then most likely you are going to see a dramatic drop in the inflation expectations. But unfortunately, there's already a game two plan to keep those inflation expectations going through the credible threat of more tariffs through the other, laws, which are very limited in their capabilities. They're not like the emergency, like just drop these tariffs and make them happen right now and then decide whether or not they're legal. The other game two plan tariffs are ones that have to come from essentially a review, right, of the possibilities of needing those tariffs. But it doesn't mean that they wouldn't come, right, or that they couldn't get voted into place. I'm just saying that right now we are in a situation in which that people have pretty much committed themselves to these tariffs, which haven't even been like voted legal yet. All right, and there's a real good possibility that they'll need to be reimbursed. In fact, there's already companies that are taking the steps to get that reimbursed money. And so to think like, man, this doesn't exist is very like, that's not right. The mechanism is already in place. And that's where I find it very amusing is like, wow, here it is. These corporations needed an inflationary scenario. Well, the monetary policy needed an inflationary scenario in order to save their monetary policy, get up off the lower bound to zero. And with that, these corporations are essentially getting punished by these tariffs, right? The corporations have to pay the tariff. And then what they do is they turn around and put that down on the people, on the consumer, who then essentially is paying the tariff, right, as the prices start to move up. And then only to find out that the tariffs are going to get removed and get reimbursed for those tariffs, but you know who doesn't get reimbursed is the consumer. So now the inflation has essentially saved the monetary policy and delivered the opportunity to give a bonus, a bailout to the corporations. Like it's all lined up. And it's all like within the legal process, like it's already, like they don't even have to make anything up to make it happen. The bailout of the corporations comes from that protest filing of the tariffs if they were deemed illegal. Like it's already a mechanism that's already there. So it's like, that's, to me, it's just like, man, that is such a setup. It was such a setup. They not only got their bailout for the corporations, but they also got the inflationary scenario that they were looking for. It's like, don't tell me like the Trump administration and the Federal Reserve aren't best friends forever. Powell and Trump are like homies, man. All right. What is that? MMA Psyche? $9.99. Thank you so much. Your clarity is clear and incredibly valuable. Cantillon, Triffin's Dilemma, liquidity sample. You save. Live below. Yeah. Liquidity simple. Right. Okay. You save, live below your means, invest in assets, bro. Thank you. Keep it up and be brutally honest, bro. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And I will. Like I don't I don't like I don't want to say that I'm not out here trying to make money. Like obviously I want to make money on YouTube. Like that's like it's an obvious thing, right? I'm out here trying to make money on YouTube. I'm not denying that. But there is ways that I could come out here and I could actually make the YouTube money happen. Like I can make it, force it out there, and I could have a big giant following of people who would definitely listen if I was to deploy a particular way of information out there. I see it, I recognize it every day when I look at some of these popular YouTube channels and I listen to some of the information, and I'm like, man, if I was to deliver the best story, I could make a bunch of money too, but it wouldn't be the truth. And that's not what I'm here for. I'm here to give you guys what it is that I am finding for the truth. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it. And I'm not going to pretend that it's something that it isn't. I've had somebody tell me, it was just like, dude, if you want to make more money, you would actually talk well about Trump. And I'm like, I don't care about making money and telling some story that I don't believe in. That's not what I'm going to do. Right? I know that the information that I am delivering out here is being helpful and useful because I get so many people who have sent me messages saying, thanking me, just like MMA Psyche did. This is the reason why I constantly come out here and share this information as often as I can in order to, help people to get a better grasp and understanding of what's happening within monetary policy and the broader economy, especially when it comes to understanding the economic forces that separate the rich from the poor. Knowing how that's taken place and why it's taken place will then give you the best ability to position yourself to deal with it. And understanding that it's asset holders that have separated themselves from the working class because the working class job doesn't do it anymore, and it's not their fault. It's not anything that they had done. It's just the way that new money comes in and separates the rich from the poor, and it will happen no matter what. It didn't come down to politicians doing it. They are a symptom. Yes, they are involved. They are a problem. There is definite finger pointing that can be done. But if you do not recognize it from the underlying force, then what you will do is you will blame politicians as the reason and not as the symptom of it. Did I see OSB? What is OSB prices showing? Right now, they seem to be pretty steady. But the unfortunate thing is that they're pulling billions of square feet of OSB production off the market. So I wouldn't give it too much more time before you start finding that the inventory depletion is going to start pushing the prices up. Without a lot of demand in the market right now, I can't imagine that you're going to see OSB prices moving up in any kind of dramatic fashion. But when you consider that they're pulling this a billion square foot of production off the market, that is going to have an impact at some point, right? Especially if there was any kind of like uptick in demand. So as of right now, like I don't see the prices moving up. They're fairly steady. Availability is there, but give it some time and we'll see what happens. Again, like I wouldn't be pushing it. Like if you need material, building materials, lumber, plywood, you might be able to get a better price for it in the future, but it's not going to be that much better. This is it. Like we are at about a low, considering all the curtailments and depletion and what I can only assume would be at some point a pop in demand out there in the future somewhere. I don't know how far out, but at some point that's going to happen, and that will have the opposite direction on the markets, and you'll see the prices move up. Honest living, greater popular narrative living. Yeah. Isn't copper the better predictor than lumber of a booming economy? Not in my opinion. Not in my opinion. It's not. Like lumber is the indicator. I was able to call it out long ahead before anybody else when it came to understanding that the inflationary scenario from the money printer was not taking place in the way that a lot of people had assumed it did. I could see that in lumber. I didn't recognize it in copper. I didn't recognize it in gold. I didn't recognize it in oil. I didn't recognize it in anything else, but I certainly did recognize it in lumber. And being in the industry gives me a much different understanding of it. I'm not looking at a price indicator like the futures. I got contacts at the mill. I got contacts up in the hills. I got contacts from the distribution hubs. I got contacts at other retailers. I got contacts in every single corner of this market, which is unlike what a lot of people out there who are delivering information do. They just go out there and do some internet research and then say, hey, look, I see where this corporation made all this money. Obviously, they're greedy manipulators, but very few people are going to be discussing with you how it is that I was talking with a surveyor who was saying that they haven't been surveying a whole lot for the mills to be demanding for logs. And so for me, I'm thinking, in my opinion, I'm looking at it saying, man, if there's not a lot of demand for the surveyors to go up into the hills, there's probably not a lot of demand for timber, not just from the mills but also from overseas, because you got to think timber has two markets to it: a domestic market and a foreign market. Timber is an agricultural product just like wheat or anything else out there. When we saw up that lumber, we generally keep most of that for ourselves. We very rarely send out a lot of lumber outside of the United States. There is a market for it outside of the United States, don't get me wrong, but when it comes to the demand for wood, it's in raw logs. Knowing that to be the case is just like, that tells a whole different story outside of the lumber industry. People asked all the time, how come it is that lumber went way up but the demand for logs is way down? That doesn't make any sense. And it was just like, do you ever think that maybe it's because the foreign buyers of those logs quit buying them? Oh, so now we got a surplus of logs. It doesn't matter how much we want to consume ourselves, we produce an abundance of logs because we are a huge agricultural forestry product producer. And if you all of a sudden have foreign buyers who are saying, nah man, counter tariffs and all the other stuff, and we're just pissed off at you for whatever reason, you can keep your logs, we can't consume all that lumber for all that wood for ourselves. Even if we were to cut up a bunch of it to lumber, it doesn't matter. We can't produce, or we cannot consume that much lumber to eat up all the trees that we want to cut down and sell. Nobody, like very few people incorporate that kind of information. They would never be able to explain to you why a tree is cheap and lumber was expensive. They never even thought about there being a foreign buyer of the tree. And I understand that copper is, it makes a lot of sense to a lot of people out there. I have my pulse on the finger of the lumber industry. There is no way that something would happen within this industry that I wouldn't feel the ripple of it before you would ever get any kind of news. Are we the number one producer of lumber? I don't know if we're the number one producer of lumber. As much as say, like, maybe, I don't know if Canada is an exporter of their forestry products, like big time. That's like that's their thing, man. And so I don't know, like, as far as the actual production of lumber itself, if we actually produce more than Canada does, but I know Canada exports more than we do. So I don't know, I guess it depends on how you would want to look at that. And that's what I'm thinking too. Canada would be the number one. You gotta understand, like, the British Columbia area is like, it's insane, like how much lumber they pump out of such a small area. And I mean, like, British Columbia isn't a small area, but when you consider the region as opposed to the entire like country of Canada and the entire United States, British Columbia is a fairly small area, and they are like the producers of producers. High output, high cost. And so very sensitive to the market. That was definitely the case, 5 to 10 years ago. And a lot of that is now shifting, shifting from British Columbia down into the southern part of the United States. So give it time and we'll see what happens. Silver hit 61. Yes, it did. All right. What do you think will happen to the stock market now that the cut in the interest rates for the third time? Nothing. All the pricing has already been done. Like they already signaled long ahead of time that there was going to be this interest rate adjustment. That was already priced in. So everything that we are experiencing with an interest rate cut has already essentially taken place within the markets. Now, if you're talking about like the conditions of the financial markets and stuff, that's going to be a 6 months to a year down the road. And then depending on the inflationary scenario 6 months down the road, how much that is actually risen or fallen will depend on whether or not the interest rate adjustment would be accommodating or restricting. So at this point, we look at like the interest rate adjustment and say, okay, what's going to happen to the markets? And that's already happened. Like that part was already priced in last week, essentially. The more confirmation that they had that there was going to be an interest rate cut, the more that priced into the market, so that by the time the interest rate cut has taken place, all the pricing has already occurred. That is the credible threat theory. Like that's how they deploy their information in order to guide the markets right into the direction that they want them to be. Typically, like if you had looked back prior to the great financial crisis, back in the Greenspan era, the interest rate adjustment that took place today would never had any communication about it leading up to this point, and people would have been debating on whether or not like they would have had no clue. No Fed official would have come out talking about it. There wouldn't have been any ideas about unemployment or anything out forcing it, or like there would have been a like economist opinion, but not from the Fed itself. They would have not deployed any information about it. They were very silent. Now they deploy all kinds of information ahead of time to gear the markets up for the rate cut. That is how they get the power out of it. If they didn't talk about it, then everything would occur the moment that they released the statement from the meeting. But now they deploy the information well ahead of time. What about the price of furniture? Is that an indicator also? I don't know. I guess it depends on where you're getting the furniture from. I mean, if it's domestic furniture, it would be different from foreign. The market should start to look forward to Trump stacking the Fed with doves. Even inside of that, I mean, I don't. How do I put this? I have not seen how it is that any appointed official has been able to do anything as far as causing a political shift within the Federal Reserve strategy. You got to think, like, the credible threat theory, literally, like, I could probably take it back further if I wanted to, but right now, I mean, I think 23 years of, like, going through the Fed statements, speeches, and stuff, I think that's a good ways back. Like, I could take it back farther. We can go back 50 years if you wanted to, but 23 years is pretty good. You go back to Ben Bernanke's speech, Deflation and How to Prevent It from Ever Occurring, or How to Prevent It from Occurring Here in the United States. That speech spells it out. It spells it out very clearly that they are going to run into the lower bound of zero, and it's going to take large-scale asset purchases and forward guidance. He said it in the speech. To think that it wouldn't, like, to think that they made it up on the fly isn't right. Right? That isn't right. People who said that Ben Bernanke didn't know what he was doing during the great financial crisis when he deployed that statement, we think we got to contain to the subprime market. People thought that for sure the Federal Reserve lost control. They had no idea what they were doing. They screwed it all up, and that created an inflation expectation. In fact, it created a hyperinflationary scenario within the mindset of the people. I know I was one of them. I dumped every dime I had into silver thinking that I was trying to save my purchasing power, only to find out by 2018 that they did not get the inflation that they were looking for, and it was completely interfering with their monetary policy. Understanding why that was happening is absolutely critical to understanding why it is that they are conducting themselves the way they are today. Right? It's a 20 plus year long message that is happening here that hasn't deviated. The strategy is still continuing. It's not shifted. It doesn't matter which president has come in and out of the game. It doesn't matter if it's Obama. It doesn't matter if it was Bush. It doesn't matter if it was Trump or Biden or anybody else, right? None of those presidents changed how it is that the Federal Reserve was dealing with the fact that they were operating with the proximity of the lower bound in a low R-star environment. This was not working out very well for them. It doesn't matter who was president. That doesn't change. That issue wasn't changing for the Fed. And when you see that they were looking to have an inflationary scenario that was elevated, an opportunistic reflation, how it is that the Federal Reserve was looking for an inflation expectation that was persistently too high rather than too low, knowing why that needed to happen to save the monetary policy is critical to understanding why it is that they are sitting in the position they are today. It doesn't have anything to do with the president. It didn't have anything to do with Biden. It didn't have anything to do with any of that stuff. All right? This had to do with the fact that they were operating at the proximity of the lower bound of zero with no real way of adjusting interest rates to stimulate the economy. That major problem needed to be solved, and it was solved with inflation expectations. An opportunistic reflation. I have gone over the Fed speeches so many times that literally I will debate anybody. I will debate anybody when it comes to monetary policy. I don't care who they are. I don't care if they worked at the Fed or not. I don't care if they think that there's some sort of professional at it. I will debate anybody because nobody has the story dialed in like I do. And I understand that I don't tell the best story at it because the best story is one that's going to scare the hell out of you and feed you full of information that doesn't really pertain to anything. It's all going to be surface level, but it's going to be super entertaining and you're probably going to eat it up, and I'm not going to do that. I know how. I could. I've done it. All right? But instead, I'm going to give you the information that I know is real. I know this is useful, and I know it's helpful, and I know that the people who have absorbed the credible threat theory and the ideas behind it have come to me and said, dude, thank you so much for sharing that information. It's unlike anybody else's, and it's actually helped. Right? I never got all the conspiracy theory information that I have internalized was so good. It was good stuff, and I enjoyed it. I learned a lot about this world and how it operates, and I can guarantee you none of it gave me any opportunity for success. None of it did. Not a single bit of it gave me any opportunity for success. Understanding how it's operated, how it is that it's going down, why it is that they do the things that they do, and it's based off of their own words, off of 10, 20 years of research, hardcore research into this stuff, in order to come up with these ideas and theories. And I know this information is by far the most accurate, way beyond the surface level stuff that you hear from most people. All right. What time is it? Oh, gee whiz, guys, that gots to go. Gold looks like it's breaking out of the consolidation depending on Powell's press conference. Yeah, I mean, I'll leave it with this, guys. If you are looking to be secure away from that third-party risk, gold and precious metals, silver is the only way to go about it. Bitcoin to a lesser extent, but even on that, that's a very, you're dependent on the exchanges and the dollar system and all that to work, but you don't have to rely on any of that stuff when you're in gold and silver. Excuse me. However, there's a lot of times I think people get very excited about the moves inside of it and thinking, oh man, I'm going to be rich. And in that case, a speculation into gold and silver, hey, that's totally cool, I get it, and I'm not having any problems with anybody trying to make money with whatever they want to do. But for me personally, I would not give up my insurance policy, especially when you see the deterioration taking place in such magnitudes like we are. Evidence of that is in the pricing. When you see that pricing move up, it's the more you would actually want to be in that metal. It's more of showing times and signs of deterioration, which is the actual movement in which that you would want to be in the precious metals, because you are trying to eliminate yourself from, or eliminate that third-party risk, get that as distant from you as possible, and the only way to do that is to acquire precious metals. So as people get excited about the price move, I'm thinking, what for? Are you planning on unloading it and then being without the insurance policy and a terrible economic environment holding cash? I mean, you better have a place to deploy that cash, I would only assume. All right. All right, guys, this was fun, but I got to go. Uneducated Economist, you let me know.